Welcome to Beyond the Coverage. I'm Chris Horner. In today's edition, I want to talk about tactics. You guys know there's good tactics, there's bad tactics, there's okay tactics, there's great tactics, there's terrible tactics, and then there's just a couple knuckleheads out there that have a little bit of everything, right? Sometimes I get asked in the comments, and I got asked recently by Go Bears, that if tactics are poor but the results are good, are they actually bad tactics? Yes, nothing changes. A lot of times I'll call somebody a knucklehead and maybe they won that race, and someone will come back in one of the replies and they'll say, Chris, they won that race. It must have been a great tactic because they won. That's the only thing that matters. Well, I'm here to explain tactics to you guys. When you're talking great tactics, good tactics, okay tactics, poor tactics, or just terrible tactics, it all starts at the beginning of the day. The finish of the stage doesn't change a thing if your tactics are good or bad. What matters if you run the tactic, is it good or is it bad? What matters is how has it performed throughout the decade? How has it performed throughout the century? How has it performed throughout this year? How has it performed throughout the month? You need some backup information there to tell whether or not if a tactic is good. If you just go with 100% tried and true tactic, which there is none, but let's say you went with the best, most classical used tactic out there. We'll talk about like the Sky Train or what the sprinters use all the time. You take the race leader, the most dominant sprinter or the most dominant general classification climber guy in the race. You get him as close to the finish and you drop him off with enough power where he can go all the way to the finish and drop everyone solo, win the stage. Sprinter, you bring him all the way into the last 200 meters, you drop him off, he wins the stage. Those are the golden tactics. It's called the train all the way in, drop him off, make the race hard enough where nobody can attack your leader going up the climb, send him off. When he leaves and drops everyone solos to the top, that's the most tried and true tactic there is. But there's all kinds of other tactics too, right? So sometimes you can have the best tactic in the world, you can use it, and they can still lose. So if you can still lose with the best tactic, well, you could probably take the worst tactic and probably still win, right? So what decides the tactic is not whether if you win or lose, it's how that tactic has been used throughout the last decade or half century or even a century. Has that tactic been used before? You have to pair up. You have to look at today's results and you have to kind of pair up that result. So we take Dauphiné, for example. We go stage 7 where we saw Jumbo-Visma bring Jonas Vingegaard all the way into the 2023 Dauphiné on stage 7. They brought him all the way in the final climb. He's the best climber in the race. Nobody's on the same form as Jonas Vingegaard. They bring him in up to the final climb. He drops everyone. He solos in. He wins his second stage at Dauphiné and this fourth stage for Jumbo-Visma winning there. That is the tried and true tactic. It is 100% used, and it has been used effectively throughout the history of cycling. So that one, whether if he wins or loses, if Jumbo-Visma had brought him all the way into stage 7 to the last climb, dropped him off, and he lost, that's still the best tactic in the world that you can possibly use because it has been successful more times than it hasn't. Probably an 80% effective rate, if not 95%. It's going to be huge. I don't know the numbers. You'd have to make it up, but it's going to be big. But you have to compare. You have to go Jumbo-Visma, and we take like Chris Froome with Sky. We take Sky there with Geraint Thomas. We take Egan Bernal. We look at all those tactics, and we see how those riders had performed. Now, when you look at Jumbo-Visma, they had the most dominant team in Dauphiné, and they had the most dominant rider, so they're running the same kind of tactic you saw with Bradley Wiggins when he won his Tour de France, and with Chris Froome when he won his Tour de France, and with Geraint Thomas when he won his Tour de France in 2018. It's tried and true. Bring in the best rider in the race, get him as far up the climb as you can with enough power put on the pedals that you've disintegrated the peloton down to a few favorites, and then your GC leader, best rider in the race, destroys everyone with one good acceleration, gets a gap, and goes to the line. Now, if something happens, let's say you get into that same stage, you got Chris Froome, he's been dominating throughout the whole Tour de France, victories of stages, and now comes into a stage. If he just happens to bonk, it doesn't mean it was a bad tactic. It's the most tried and true, perfect tactic you can have. So, when you start talking about Dauphiné and you look at stage 7 where Jumbo-Visma dropped off Jonas Vingegaard, like I said, he won the stage. Then they go into stage 8. They decide the most tried and true tactic is not the one they want to use. They want to mix it up. Now, I assume they're mixing it up because they believe that if someone thinks they're going to run this tactic that they ran on stage 7, if they run a different one on stage 8, it'll be more successful. That's not true. In fact, that is a medium tactic at best to try to change tactics around. When you have the strongest team and the best rider in the world, there's only one tried and true tactic. Get your rider as far into the final climb and up the final climb with as much power to disintegrate the peloton of GC favorites. Normally there'll still be 2, 3, maybe 5 riders left. And then let your rider, like Jonas Vingegaard, accelerate and destroy those guys and solo into the finish. That's the best tactic. We take, for example, stage 8 of Jumbo-Visma's Dauphiné 2023, where they decided to change things up. They put Thies Benoot in the front group. The only problem is when we look at that front group, Julian Alaphilippe's in that front group, and Giulio Ciccone from Trek Segafredo's in that front group. Now, we look at it and you go, well, Thies Benoot has a free ride in that front group, but he has to do some effort to get in there. And after that, he's going to do less work in that group than, of course, the other riders. Problem is, that's a mountainous stage where they're going over a couple mountains that'll finish that stage. And when you look at the history of how often this tactic has worked, it's probably performed 50% of the time where a solid quality rider like Thies Benoot sitting on can win the stage. But then when we look a little bit deeper at Thies Benoot's results, he doesn't win that often, right? Belgium rider has about 2 big wins on his resume. He's got one this year and one of the semi-classics early here in 2023. Then you got to go back a few years and go to Strade Bianche when he won there. And those are his only results really on his resume of top concern. Now you start looking at a Julian Alaphilippe, well, double road world champion. Then you look at Giulio Ciccone. Well, Ciccone's worn the race leader's jersey at the Tour de France and won stages throughout all the last few years. That Trek Segafredo rider, Ciccone, has won big-time races, and he's on flying form, of course, in the 2023 season. So when you start dissecting the tactic of Stage 8 of Dauphiné, you start thinking, this is maybe an okay tactic at best. It's not good. It's certainly not great. It's not necessarily a bad tactic, and that's why I said up on the butterfly effect, it's not a tactic I would use because Jumbo-Visma is the strongest team in the race at Dauphiné, and Jonas Vingegaard is untouchable. There's nobody that's on the form in the 2023 Dauphiné that Jumbo-Visma's Jonas Vingegaard has, and so if you get him into the next climb, it doesn't matter. I could have been directing Jumbo-Visma for Stage 8, and I could have sent out a fax, an email. I could have sent out a hand personal note letter to every team in the race that said, this is the way I'm going to ride Stage 8. Just like I did Stage 7. I'm going to ride my team on the front. I'm going to control everybody. I'm going to bring it into the last climb, and I'm going to launch Jonas Vingegaard up the final climb. And there's nothing anybody at Dauphiné could have done about it to have kept the victory away from Jonas Vingegaard, with the exception of a crash, injury, flat tire, or something like that happening. Jonas Vingegaard was going to win Stage 8 of Dauphiné. But Jumbo-Visma love to mix up the tactics. I'm sure they must be sitting up there in the office thinking, okay, we ran the number 1 most tried and true tactic on Stage 7. Now we want to go into Stage 8 and we want to mix it up so nobody knows what we're doing. You don't have to do it when you have a team like Jumbo-Visma. You stick to the most tried and true tactic that works for every top sprinter in the world, to have his lead out man take him up to 200 meters to go and then drop him off. And if that sprinter's any good, he's going to win every time if he's good and his teammates did the best tactic in the world of dropping him off at 200 meters. Best climber in the world is almost the exact same tactic as you would see the sprinters use, except for they're going uphill. You got to get them up there. You got to blow the field up, and that's how you employ the best tactic. Now, you can see some other strange tactics that don't quite fit into the story, right? You have great tactics all the way down to poor knuckleheadism tactics, and sometimes there's a few of those that don't fit in any of those. So I'll tell you a story from 2003 when I'm racing with Team Saturn. We're doing the Redlands Classic. We're on the last stage of the race. Saturn's dominating the race. We have myself, Tom Danielson, and Nathan O'Neill in the general classification, and I'm the race leader when we're starting the Sunset Loop. When we look over at the Prime Alliance team, they had David Klinger there, that if he wins the first KOM sprint point at the top of the first climb of the Sunset Loop, he's going to mathematically win the KOM classification. It's going to be done. Okay, no problem. We weren't interested in that. As the race gets going, Prime Alliance rides the front right away from kilometer 0. We hit the course, start going up the climb, and Jonathan Vaughters drills it. Now, it's a good tactic for Jonathan Vaughters to have gone to the front and set the pace at a pace fast enough that nobody wants to attack, but it's a bad tactic if he sets the pace so fast that he blows up the whole field and blows up his KOM race leader that he's trying to get up to the top of the KOM, and he launches 3 Saturn riders that are top 5 of the general classification when that stage started. That's what happened. We go up the climb. Jonathan Vaughters, instead of just doing a steady rhythm up the first time up the climb so David Klinger could sprint and win the KOM to mathematically secure the jersey, instead Vaughters went full gas. He destroyed the peloton. They sat up back there. They let the 5 of us go away. Vaughters with about 500, 600 meters before the top there, he pulled off hard right and dropped anchor and left his KOM leader sitting there with 3 Saturn riders, the 3 best riders at the Redlands Bicycle Classic at that year's 2003 edition. Now, Klinger, he's looking around. He didn't know what to do, so he started riding a little bit at the front, and then he blew up and pulled over his side, and we rode right by him. We weren't even interested in the KOM jersey. We took the KOM jersey. We got to the top of the climb. Danielson looked back. When Tom Danielson looked back, he said, "Chris, we got a gap. What do you want to do? Should we punch it and go?" And I said, "Nah, Danielson, this is like one of these tactics you never see. You never see 3 riders from the same team go from kilometer 0, get dropped off by another team up the first categorized climb, and have a 45-second gap." When I look back, I look at Danielson, I'm like, no, we're going to go back. There's no doubt about it. We're going back. And then I look further down the hill, and I realized the kind of gap that he saw when he first looked. And with that 45-second gap to the first riders of the peloton back there, I looked at Tom Danielson, Nathan O'Neill. I said, we're punching it. We're going 100%. Now, I knew this was a tactic not employed. It's not one that you would see. You can't go back into the history and pull up last weekend they used this tactic. 1 month ago they used this tactic. 2 months, 10 years ago. This tactic is not employed often. It's really rare to go from kilometer 0 with 3 riders and in the top 5 of the general classification and one wearing the race leader's jersey and go from kilometer 0 and punch it. So we punched it. We're going around the course, and we have an amazing director sportif named Andrzej Beck, Polish director. He was fantastic work with and was very intelligent. Now, I knew when we were coming around the second time coming up the climb that Andrzej Beck was going to look at me and hold me accountable for what we were doing here at the 2003 Sunset Loop Redlands Bicycle Classic. He's on the race radio. He's saying, "What are you doing, Chris? Back off, go back to the peloton. This is a ridiculous tactic." But what I saw that day there at the Redlands Bicycle Classic was Jonathan Vaughters, who was sitting 3rd or 4th on the general classification when that stage started. He punched it up that climb, and that was their number 1 rider on Prime Alliance. He punched it till he completely blew up and dropped anchor. Then David Klinger, their KOM rider that he was riding for, punched it and blew up and dropped anchor and went back and left 3 guys sitting top 5 on the general classification at the top of the climb with a 45-second gap. Now that told me right there that that's basically free time. So we punched it, and I told Andrzej Beck, we got a plan here. We're going to go hard. He was yelling and screaming at me, telling me to back off. The wise choice is to back off because this tactic is not employed often, and there's a reason why. It's rare that it would ever work. But in the scenario where I saw it in 2003 was the second best team in the race already used up their first best rider and probably their 3rd best rider. That meant they had Danny Pate back there, they had Michael Creed back there, and they had Alex Candelario back there, but he's more of a sprinter. Their weaker riders were going to ride first, which meant we could ride steady at the front, and we extended the gap out for about another 45 seconds to have 1:30. Now, what I really want to know from Andrzej Beck, once we got a few laps into the Sunset Loop, was when Danny Pate was going to be the rider from Prime Alliance that started pulling, because he was the only rider I was worried about from that team being able to do a big-time chase and pull the 3 of us back. I told Andrzej Beck, when he gets on the front, you let us know right away, because as soon as you know he's on the front, I want to know, because when he gets on the front, we're going to punch it as hard as we can so he can't bring the gap down. And I know Danny Pate is a remarkable rider because I was teammates with him the year before, and he was the number 2 ranked rider in the U.S. at the end of that 2002 season. He was the number 2 ranked rider in the U.S. season, so I knew he was a big-time threat. Once he got on the front, Anjay Beck radioed to us that he was on, and we started pulling as hard as we could for 2 laps to make sure that there wasn't any kind of confusion about whether Danny Pate could bring this group back. Because if he got motivated and started bringing the gap back, we were going to lose and possibly get caught and then get attacked. Of course, that tactic is one of those ones that you don't see often. It doesn't fit in that range of good or bad. But every time when you're watching a race, 90, 95, 98% of the time, you can see the tactic that they're doing in the race and then pair it up to a tactic that you saw yesterday, last week, 2 weeks ago, a month ago, and certainly in the last 10 years. You ask yourself, how many times has that tactic been successful? And that is what decides if it's a great tactic, a good tactic, okay tactic, a slightly bad one, or a completely wrecked one, or just absolute knuckleheads on whether or not if that tactic was successful on that day means nothing. What matters is how it has performed throughout the last decade and century of bike racing. That's what decides if a tactic is good, bad, okay, or miserable. So when I talk about some riders being knuckleheads, stage 8 at Dauphiné, putting Tiesj Benoot in the front group with 2 tried and true professionals as Julian Alaphilippe and Giulio Ciccone, that is a knucklehead tactic when you have Jonas Vingegaard back there, who's clearly 2 steps above everybody at Dauphiné, and Jumbo-Visma is the best team in the race. Guys, you get into that race, you mirror the same tactics that you did on stage 7. When stage 8 comes, it doesn't matter if you send a postcard to everybody 2 weeks in advance and said, stage 8, we're going to ride just like stage 7. There's nothing anybody can do about it, and that's why the best tactics in the world are successful and have been successful throughout the history of cycling. Whether if they win or lose does not change whether or not if it was a good tactic or not. And this is what's always drives me crazy. Back when I was working with NBC, I won't be working with them for this year's Tour de France. They've hired new help to come up onto the studio there in Connecticut to shoot the Tour de France. So every time when I was working with them, I would try to explain some of the tactics, and sometimes I'd say, hey, these are miserable tactics. We look at last year during the Tour de France, and we look at that stage 11 that I broke down for you with Tadej Pogačar, Primož Roglič, and Jonas Vingegaard, and there was moments, even with Jumbo-Visma's tactics, where I said they dropped a golden egg when Tadej Pogačar was attacking those 2. He could have gone up the road solo, and they could have just chased behind 30 seconds the whole time and held him out there. He'd have been in the wind the whole time. They have Wout van Aert at the top there of the Col de Telegraph, drop down the Col de Galibier. He pulls on the front, whole time for his 2 teammates behind. They hold Tadej Pogačar. Wout van Aert pulls him back at the bottom of the climb and lights things up. But when you look at it and you're on film and you see that Jonas Vingegaard wins going up the Col de Grenade, all the NBC executives say it was a great tactical race. It was good tactics, but it could be better. Wasn't a knucklehead tactic at all. I never called it that. It was beautiful, but it could always be better. And every time when I raced throughout my career, whether if I won, if I lost, I always dissected the race and tried to find where those mistakes were. And there was always mistakes made. Even though I won, and I've won about 100 races throughout my career, the win does not decide whether if the tactic was good. The history of that tactic is what decides. So remember, pair up what you're watching. You have to pair up the quality of the rider that's going up the road and the tactic being used with what has been used in the past history of cycling. And then you know whether or not if you have a good tactic, an okay tactic, or you got a knuckleheadism tactic that you're viewing. It doesn't matter whether if the rider wins. It matters how often that tactic has been used and how often that tactic has been successful. Make sure you guys like and subscribe, and I'll see you guys on the next edition of Beyond the Coverage real soon.